The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. If you're a new listener to our podcast, I'm Wes, and that's my wife and co-host Beth.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Believe it or not, this week marks our 1-year anniversary of Where Our Minds Wander. We debuted our show on June 10th last year, and here we are 1 year later doing our 58th episode.
Yeah, that's right. Not counting our premium bonus episodes, it's episode 58. And really quick, if you haven't checked out our premium content episodes yet, give one a try. You're not locked into anything. It's not a monthly recurring subscription or anything like that. You can just pick one that you want to listen to. And if you like what you hear, you can always pick another, when you're in the mood.
Right. It can be a one-time thing, or you can listen every month. It's totally up to you. So back in February or March of 2022, Wes and I were sitting in our living room, having a few drinks, listening to one of the many podcasts we listen to, and Wes said, "I'd like to do a podcast. I think it could be fun," which was really funny to me because I had been sitting there thinking the exact same thing. So we spitballed some ideas, and I grabbed my trusty notebook and started jotting some stuff down.
I kind of knew right off the bat where, I wanted to focus on, like the supernatural and the paranormal, because it's a topic that's always fascinated me. And I knew it had fascinated Beth also since we were kids. But we also really like old historical things or unsolved mysteries or things that are just plain weird or unusual. So we came up with the idea of, kind of incorporating all the things we like into one show. It's kind of like the stuff in our house, a mishmash of old unusual things and stuff that brings up interesting conversations.
And figuring out what we wanted to cover on the show was pretty easy, but coming up with a name for the show, that was not so easy. We spent a long time coming up with names like Weird Shit Happens. And after weeks of not being able to come up with something that encompassed everything, it dawned on me that I had a defunct blog that had a pretty good name. So we changed one word and we had a show name.
Yep. And then we went out and purchased a bunch of stuff.
Yep.
Hopefully, it would work out because we delved right in. And then we recorded our first episode. We put ourselves out there and we were pretty excited that people actually wanted to listen to us.
And we have the best listeners.
We really do. There are so many of you wanderers who have stuck with us from the very beginning. We really appreciate all of you so much. And we keep getting new listeners every week. And we want to say thank you to those, that have stuck with us and have decided to listen to us. So we really appreciate all of you.
Yes. Thank you very much, you guys.
So I guess with all that little bit of background said, let's skip the housekeeping tonight and get right into our first topic. Well,
our only topic.
That's true. I'm so used to doing two topics that I forgot we're doing the one topic tonight. So it's something a little different. We do it on our bonus premium episodes.
Yes.
But we figured tonight this topic really needed to be delved into a little deeper. So it really needed to be all one show instead of breaking up into two.
Yeah. And I had mentioned it last week when you were talking about the witch bottles that people have found in their walls. So I'm pretty excited about it because all of it was new information for me.
I know you were pretty excited about it.
I am.
You don't get excited about too much.
No.
Except for books and documentaries and things like that. So why don't you get us started tonight?
Okay. So pretty much everyone in the United States has heard of the Salem witch trials. Between February 1692 and May of 1693, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts. Of those 200, 30 were found guilty, which resulted in 25 deaths, 19 by hanging, 1 by pressing, and 5 while in jail awaiting either trial or execution. The Salem witch trials have become part of our well-known history, spawning plays, movies, countless books, and a booming tourist town. But what about Hartford, Connecticut?
That's what I want to know. What about it?
Well, like Salem, Hartford had their own witch panic, but unlike Salem, Hartford has pretty much kept their witch trials a complete secret for hundreds of years. Dutch settlers arrived in Connecticut in 1614, adopting the Algonquin name for the area. The Algonquin called it Long Tidal River, or Quinettuckut, and the Dutch, who were mostly fur traders, decided to call their colony by a variation of that name. 19 years later, a Puritan minister in England named Thomas Hooker was having some problems with the Archbishop of Canterbury and was forced to leave the country. Hooker decided to head to the New World, and he settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He found work as a minister for a while, but he thought Boston was way too crowded. So in 1635, he moved to Connecticut with his assistant, Samuel Stone, and 100 followers from their congregation. They settled a little north of the existing Dutch settlement. Samuel Stone was born in Hartford, England, and so the new settlement was also named Hartford. Because Connecticut wasn't part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Hooker was able to pretty much set up his own government. He wrote all of his laws down, which is why Connecticut is known as the Constitution State. Hooker basically wrote the very first one in the colonies. So, Hartford, Connecticut was a colony of Puritans, and just 12 years later, they hung the first person ever accused of witchcraft in all of the colonies, 45 years before the Salem witch trials.
So, not much is known about Alice Young, because as we said before, Connecticut didn't keep many records of their witch hunts or executions of accused witches, and certainly not official ones. What historians do agree on is that she lived in Windsor, and at some point an epidemic swept through the town, and it took the lives of several of the town's children, including the child of the nearest neighbor. Alice had her own young daughter, and because her child didn't get sick and didn't die, the townsfolk believed Alice was a witch. According to the Puritan beliefs at the time, anyone accused of witchcraft must have signed some sort of contract with the devil. Anyone who showed any pride, discontent, greed, or lying could be a witch. Puritans were deathly afraid of a witch's supposed magical powers, especially maleficium, which was the ability to curse or harm other people through magical means. Alice was found guilty, although how or why was lost to time, and she was hung at the gallows in Hartford in 1647. Now, the only reason we even know this is because in 1904, historians discovered an entry in Matthew Grant's diary. Grant was Windsor's second town clerk. The entry simply said, May 26, 47, Alice was hanged. Then in 1648, a second woman was accused and executed. What she was accused of exactly, or who even accused her, is again lost to time. But we do know that one charge against her was for simple theft. House servant Mary Johnson was tortured and interrogated until finally she admitted to, quote, familiarity with the devil. She said she had sex with both men and devils, and she allegedly confessed to murdering a child also. So let's keep in mind, she was tortured until she confessed to all these things. She was imprisoned in Hartford, but was not executed until June 6, 1650, because When she was first brought to the jail 2 years earlier, she was pregnant. So although neither of the women was from Hartford, they were both brought there to be executed. And so were Joan and John Carrington, a middle-aged couple from Wethersfield. John was a carpenter and a farmer. He was involved in at least 2 court cases. One resulted in him being fined 10 pounds for bartering a gun with a Native American. I couldn't find any information as to why they were both accused, but they both were charged of witchcraft on February 20th, 1651. They were both convicted on March 6, 1651, and hanged in Hartford.
And about 11 years after that, Hartford itself was overrun with witchcraft accusations. Samuel Stone, he was the guy who named Hartford Hartford, a man named Joseph Haynes, and Samuel Hooker, who was the son of the founding father and minister Thomas Hooker, formed a prosecutorial tribunal. Well, that's a tough one.
That is a tough one. Glad you did it.
A prosecutorial tribunal. There, that was better. And they overheard the cases. And there were, unfortunately, several. It all seemed to start with Goodwife Ayres, a woman who I think was only doing the right thing, but whose first name I wasn't able to find anywhere. Every source I looked at only has her listed as Goodwife, which was basically the Puritan form of Mrs. So we don't even know what her first name was. Anyways, for some reason, an 8-year-old girl named Elizabeth Kelly had gone to Goodwife Ayres' house. Maybe it was to help with chores or to play with the Ayres' little boy. Elizabeth came home and was totally fine. The next day, Goodwife Ayres paid a visit to the Kelly home and she shared a bowl of broth with the little girl. That night, Elizabeth became very sick. For 5 days, the poor child had horrific stomach pains and suffered delusions. Nowadays, historians believe Elizabeth had bronchial pneumonia, but at the time, Elizabeth's delusions sealed the fate of Goodwife Ayres. Elizabeth's mother testified during Goodwife Ayres' trial that Elizabeth cried out, quote, "Father, Father, help me, help me. Goodwife Ayres is upon me. She chokes me. She kneels on my belly. She will break my bowels. She pinches me. She will make me black and blue. Goodwife Ayres torments me. She pricks me with pins. She will kill me. O Father, set on the great furnace and scald her. Get the broad axe and cut off her head."
That's pretty sick.
Yeah, that poor kid. I mean, what
I
was
know.
she seeing in her fevered delusions that would make her say those things? They had to be horrible nightmares
Very
that she was
disturbing,
having.
yes.
After suffering for 5 days, little Elizabeth passed away. As you can imagine, the Kellys were certain that Goodwife Ayres had used witchcraft on their child. They believed that the woman had taken possession of their child and strangled her through black magic. Why else would Elizabeth had said those things and begged her father to kill the woman by chopping off her head? The townsfolk of Hartford were quick to jump on the accusations, spreading rumors that Goodwife Ayres had been talking about her encounters with the devil for a long time. It was only a matter of time, they said, until she would have cursed them. Part of the prosecutorial tribunal's tactics for getting Goodwife Ayres to confess was to bring her to where Elizabeth Kelly's body was laid out. They made her stand next to the child, and then they pointed out that Elizabeth's upper arms and shoulders showed devil's marks, bruises that had been on the child's body for days. They also claimed a red mark appeared on Elizabeth's cheek, on the same side of her body that Goodwife Ayres was made to stand next to. All of these were witches' marks, obviously put there by Goodwife Ayres.
Right, but no one really examined bodies back then, as far as how they break down after death.
Of course.
And that was 1647 Connecticut, so, you wouldn't expect that.
Right. They didn't stop there, though. They called in a doctor from Guilford, which was about 20 miles away, who performed what might have been the very first autopsy in Connecticut. He concluded that Elizabeth's body was too pliant and too full of blood to have been a natural death. It had to have been brought on by supernatural means. Never mind that a good number of sources that I looked at said that when he opened her up, he actually had no idea what he was even looking at, or that in the time it took for him to travel from Guilford to Hartford, her body had already started to decompose, or the fact that blood doesn't just evaporate from your body as soon as you die. Luckily, Goodwife Ayres actually escaped execution. She actually escaped Hartford completely by running away with her husband, William. For unknown reasons, they left their 8-year-old son behind in Hartford, though.
Well, I'm thinking that it was probably a lot safer to leave her son behind than bring him with them and putting their son in even more danger.
Maybe, but I'm also wondering if he then had to spend the rest of his life either denouncing his parents or defending them, or if he was ostracized for most of his life. But like Goodwife Ayres' first name, I couldn't even find his name, so there was no way to follow to the end of the story.
Yeah, there's no way to ever find out. So in 1662, in Hartford, a young woman named Anne Cole began acting strangely. Once incredibly proper, she now would suddenly lapse into uncontrollable fits, where she would shake violently and say blasphemous things. She worried aloud that evil spirits were coming for her, saying that an evil one's familiars were conspiring against her. Sometimes she would utter nothing but gibberish, or as Doctor Who would say, gobbledygook. And
where did that come from?
Because I love Doctor Who and his sayings. As soon as I saw gibberish, I'm thinking Doctor Who and gobbledygook.
Gobbledygook?
Yep. That's what I said.
It was close.
Gobbledygook. Oh, gobbledygook. Never mind. It's an awesome word anyway. But back to the story. She began speaking with a perfect Dutch accent, which was not how she normally talked. The Coles did have new Dutch neighbors, the Varlet family, but authorities doubted that Anne had come in contact with them often enough to be able to imitate their accent as well as she did. Sometimes her fits would be physically violent, and it didn't matter if she was out in public either. They just seemed to happen without warning. Ministers were brought in to help her out, but Anne insisted it was the work of the devil. And then she named someone, Rebecca Greensmith. It was no secret that the townsfolk didn't really like the Greensmiths all that much. Rebecca had been married 3 times and had 5 children with her previous 2 husbands. Now, her previous husbands had died, and Nathaniel was number 3. The minister, John Whiting, referred to her as lewd, ignorant, and considerably aged.
Wow. He didn't like her character or her looks, apparently. Are ministers supposed to judge how old someone looks?
Well, I don't think anyone should judge anyone, but I guess it's human nature, and I think being a minister doesn't exclude you from that, whether it's right or wrong. So now it's fair to say, Rebecca's current husband, Nathaniel Greensmith, wasn't well liked either. He was accused of stealing a hoe. Wow.
You're such a child.
He was accused of stealing a hoe and a bushel and a half of wheat and lying in court. He was also accused of battery. When Anne Cole named Rebecca as the witch, she had a very public fit while attending church, and then 2 other people had the same similar fits during the same service.
Anne had a fit and then 2 other people did?
Yes.
Huh.
So the town of Hartford had all the proof they needed against Rebecca. Rebecca was arrested, and then she was interviewed by Reverend Whiting and one member of the tribunal, Joseph Haynes. We don't know what sort of torture was used or how many relentless hours they interrogated her for, but Rebecca Greensmith had a lot to say in the end. She claimed the devil did appear to her in the form of a deer. She claimed that she and several other townsfolk, including William and Goodwife Ayres, as well as Judith Varlet, the Dutch neighbor, had danced with the devil in the woods. They had all drank, and they expressed their desire to do bad things to neighbors they didn't like. Wow, I mean, doesn't everybody do that?
I know. It sounds like a typical summer party.
That it does. She named several other witches, including Elizabeth Seeger, who Beth will talk about in a bit. But Rebecca had the most to say about her husband, Nathaniel. She said she lived in constant fear of him, since he had a horrible reputation before their marriage. And it wasn't just that. She had seen him lift more weight than any normal man should be able to, and wild animals seemed to just follow him around wherever he went. The tribunal found both Nathaniel and Rebecca guilty of witchcraft. Nathaniel's sentence read as follows: "Thou art here indicated by the name of Nathaniel Greensmith for not having the fear of God before thine eyes. Thou hast entertained familiarity with Satan, the grand enemy of God and mankind, and by his help has acted things in preternatural way beyond human abilities in a natural course for which, according to the law of God and the established law of this commonwealth, thou deservest to die."
Jeez.
I don't even know how they spoke like that. I mean,
I know. I told you Old English. I mean, that's not even old English. It sounds like a completely different language.
It's god awful.
Yeah. This whole thing is god awful, though. I mean, I know we've been joking and, in between, but it's not funny, really, the things that they did to these people.
No, it's not. And you should feel bad. Maybe you're a witch. Rebecca confessed, but Nathaniel insisted to the end that he was innocent of all charges. Now, the water test was a real thing back then, although it was often used as an execution method rather than an actual test. First, the person would be cross-bound, which means they would have their right hand roped to their left toe and their left hand roped to their right toe. Then they were put into shallow water, usually a pond. The idea behind it was that a witch had renounced baptism, so water repelled them by making them float. If they did float, they were definitely a witch. If they drowned, they weren't. So either way, you're kind of frickin' screwed.
Either way.
I just don't understand that type of mentality.
I know. I don't understand the rationale or the logic to some of their thinking.
However, this method was deemed too inaccurate by the Tribunal of Hartford, and so hanging became the preferred method of execution. Nathaniel and Rebecca were hanged.
Just to go back to the water test thing for a second, it's been so overdone in movies and books, even thinking about the Monty Python movies and the she's a witch, burn her stuff, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I think on some level, I thought that it had to be made up and that it didn't really happen. But it did, which it frustrates me because, like you said, the logic of it, if you survive the intentional drowning, you're a witch and they're just going to hang you anyway. But if you don't survive, you weren't a witch, but you're still dead. So, I mean, I kind of understand that people believed what they believed based on their superstitions and knowledge or lack of knowledge of science at that time. So on one hand, they were going on what they had. But it's unfortunate and upsetting that they made decisions based on what they thought they knew, which I guess is all any of us can do. I don't know. I'm going in circles. But the rationality, the logic of the whole water thing just doesn't make logical sense to me.
No, it doesn't make sense whatsoever. Even if they had their beliefs back then about witches, they should know that you can't just take a human and drown them.
And expect them to survive, but then kill them anyway if
Right.
they do. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a good place to take a break before we go on with the rest of the episode.
Sure.
We'll be right back.
Hey, did you know? Many creatures in folklore can be stopped by placing objects in your home that they must stop and count. Like the boo hag, who has to stop and count all the holes in a colander. Vampires are no exception. It was believed that if you threw mustard seeds outside your door or placed a fishing net outside a window, the vampire would have to stop and count every single seed or every single hole in the net, keeping them occupied until sunrise. So, it was kind of brilliant that the lovable Muppet character, the Count, was a vampire. Who'da thunk it?
Alrighty, we're back from the break. Beth, why don't you pick up where we left off?
Okay, so the accuser, Anne Cole, wasn't finished. She was the one who was having unexplained, uncontrollable fits, and she had named other neighbors as potential witches besides Rebecca Greensmith. And Rebecca had mentioned some of the same people during her confessions. If you remember, during her trial, Rebecca had testified that she had been to meetings in the woods with a handful of Hartford residents, including a woman named Elizabeth Seeger. Elizabeth Seeger was known to have a sharp tongue, and she wasn't tried as a witch just once. She was actually accused and brought to trial 3 times, twice in 1663 and once in 1665. When Joseph Haynes came to tell her that she was being accused of witchcraft, she apparently replied that it was all hodgepodge. We don't know if the accusations against her were brought on by jealousy or property disputes or just because people didn't like her, but there were plenty of people who testified against her. I'll paraphrase what a man named Robert Stern said about her. I saw this woman, Goodwife Seeger, in the woods with 3 more women, and with them were 2 black creatures. There was a kettle over a fire, and they danced around it with these creatures. Besides dancing around a kettle in the woods with other women, Elizabeth was accused of making villagers sick, killing livestock, and talking to Satan. Another neighbor, a Mrs. McGatt, she didn't get a good wife title. She was just a Mrs.
Well, maybe she wasn't a Puritan.
I don't know. That's a good explanation, though. She claimed that Elizabeth harassed her constantly and once even floated above her bed while she and her husband were sleeping. When Mrs. McGatt tried to wake her husband so he could do something about the spectral apparition, he wouldn't wake up no matter what she did. Unlike Rebecca Greensmith, Elizabeth Seeger fought back. She didn't just sit there and take what her neighbors dished out. She was pretty vocal about stating that they were only picking and choosing certain parts of conversations she'd had with them and not telling the whole story. You know, kind of like taking things out of context.
Right.
Except the accusers pointed out that even though she complained that they weren't telling the whole story in her defense, she didn't deny that she was consorting with Satan. Surprisingly, though, Elizabeth Seeger was let go all 3 times that she was accused on account of insufficient evidence.
Unbelievable.
I know.
So now to double back for just a second. On the day that Rebecca and Nathaniel Greensmith were hanged at Gallows Hills on January 25th, 1663, a 3rd person was also hanged for witchcraft right beside them. Her name was Mary Barnes. Although she originally settled in Hartford with her husband Thomas, the Barnes moved to Farmington, Connecticut, as 2 of its original settlers, and they had 4 children. Farmington was also a Puritan town, and in the year of 1662, when Mary was 32 years old, she found herself accused of witchcraft.
I wondered if anyone said she looked considerably aged.
Wow, that really bothers you, doesn't it?
Well, it's just a weird thing to say. Like, was he implying that she had this stereotypical old hag kind of witch look to her?
Well, yeah, it kind of sounds like that, but I think because of all the children she had, he was really making a derogatory remark about her being kind of worn out. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, well, some of us don't age as gracefully as others.
Although 2 of Mary's children were baptized in the church and her husband Thomas was a member, Mary was not. Thomas had gotten involved in a legal dispute at some point, accusing a neighbor's servant of stealing a scythe and an ox. The servant was found guilty and punished by whipping and time in the stocks. Then he was made to apologize publicly to Thomas. Mary was named in an adultery suit as a witness, but as far as we can tell, that case never made it to trial. She had also testified in another trial where she claimed that she and a neighbor had quarreled over ducks and pork.
Lawyers in Puritan colonial towns must have made a boatload of money because it seems like everyone was constantly accusing each other of all kinds of things.
Yeah, it must have been a great time to be a lawyer. Unfortunately, though, for Mary, she also knew Rebecca Greensmith. She would have known at least a little bit about the Greensmith trial that was happening. So who knows what she thought when Rebecca named her as a witch also.
I'm curious to know why people would name other people. Like, I'm assuming they were being interrogated over and over and tortured and asked the same question over and over. But did they name people they didn't like? Or did they name people who they thought had the best chance of being found innocent? Like, I'm just curious why they chose the specific people that they did.
Well, we'll really never know. But I can imagine it's just like today with people. You know, you have people in the town that you may not like, and this is one quick way to get rid of them.
Well, true. I don't know, I really want to know the answers to those types of things because that's what drives me crazy about historical stuff is I want to know the reasoning behind everything and what they were thinking and experiencing and why they made the decisions that they made.
Yeah, well.
I know, we'll never know.
No, you'll never know. Unless you can, get a time machine like Doctor Who, go back and find out for yourself. So during her trial, which began on January 3rd, 1663, Mary did not confess nor defend herself. Her husband did not come to her defense either. In fact, there's no record that he even attended her trial.
Well, like you had said earlier, maybe he was worried that if he did defend her, he'd be accused too.
Right. He just didn't want anything to do with it. He did pay the 21 shillings for her to stay in the jail between her trial and her execution, though.
Well, I don't really know what to think about that.
That is rather odd. Also, colonial jails were just holding tanks for people between their trial and their execution. And people being held in jail only ate when local people dropped off donated food. So I think it means that he made sure that she was fed every day.
Oh, okay.
Mary, as well as Nathaniel and Rebecca Greensmith, were brought to Gallows Hill in an ox cart. Although she wasn't the last person to be accused of witchcraft in Hartford, she was the last person to be hanged for it. 3 months after her death, her husband Thomas remarried. Part of his marriage contract was to banish all his biological children with Mary from their home, except for his son Benjamin, which he did. He had 2 children with his new wife, and when he died, he left everything to them. His children with wife Mary were left out of his will.
Wow. So he paid for her to be fed, but then once she was gone, he wanted nothing to do with anything to do with her, including their children.
Yep. And lastly, there's Mary Sanford. There's very little known about her. She was accused, and some historians argue that she was hanged for witchcraft, since her husband moved away and remarried 5 years later. But there's no official record of what happened to her after she was accused. So what about Anne Nicole, the woman who started it all? It seems that once all of the people she accused were executed, her fits completely stopped. She married a widower with 8 children and remained devout for the rest of her life. From 1662 to 1663, it was a year of complete witchcraft panic in Hartford. And although Mary Barnes was the last person to be executed for being an alleged witch, she wasn't the last person to be accused and brought to trial.
Catherine Harrison became a widow in 1666, raising her 3 daughters alone on the Wethersfield farm her husband had left her. The farm was worth a whopping £1,000, so she was considered one of the wealthiest people in town. Almost immediately, her neighbors pounced on her. They destroyed her crops and physically harmed her livestock, including 1 cow and 2 oxen. Despite other witnesses coming forward in her defense, saying they knew who did it, Catherine was never compensated for the attacks on her property. In 1668, she was accused of slandering a neighbor, Goody Griswold, and Goody was a shorter way of saying good wife. To retaliate, one neighbor claimed that Catherine had stolen milk from him, and when he tried to confront her in the act, his arm was frozen stiff as if by an unseen force, and Catherine was able to get away. So that was all it took. Soon, a bunch of her neighbors were claiming she used black magic, called out to the devil in the swamp, practiced fortune-telling, and appeared in a spectral form to taunt and frighten them. On May 11, 1669, Catherine was brought to jail to await trial. She pleaded not guilty. The Connecticut governor at the time, Governor Winthrop, was rather progressive. He studied alchemy, science, and reason, and he didn't like the idea of executing women, especially because of witchcraft accusations. Catherine's trial actually went through 3 different juries. The first jury couldn't reach a verdict at all, but the second jury found her guilty. Winthrop refused to accept this verdict, though, since almost all of the evidence was based on spectral visitation of Catherine that people claimed they'd had. He said spectral visitations were entirely subjective, and he'd only consider actions done by Catherine physically. So he was a smart cookie. He was like, you can't claim that her specter, visions of her coming and doing things to you and expecting to get away with it. I only want physical stuff,
He was exactly what they needed at that time.
Winthrop had Catherine respond in writing to every single accusation brought against her, basically having her fight her own defense. Finally, a year later, in May of 1670, Catherine was released from jail. However, she was permanently banished from the Connecticut colony. She moved to the Hudson Valley of New York, where not long after, she was accused of witchcraft again. So, I came across this when I was looking up witch bottles because you had mentioned them in the last episode that was part of your topic.
Yes.
And I wanted to see if there were any that were found in Connecticut because of the panic that they'd had in Hartford. And that rabbit hole sent me to sites about the Hudson Valley witch panic. And as I was just scrolling through, I saw the name Catherine Harrison, and I was like, no way. There's no way that it's the same woman. And it was the same woman. So New York was actually considered a relatively witch panic-free place. But of the few known cases in the Hudson Valley, Catherine Harrison found herself on trial again after she got into some sort of land dispute with a neighbor. I mean, the poor woman couldn't catch a break.
I mean, what's the chances of that happening?
Well, I had mentioned to you, we were talking about this the other night, and I had mentioned to you that it was funny to me that a lot of these witchcraft accusations came after these people were involved in other trials.
Right.
So, like you said...
It seemed to follow them around.
Yeah. They had gone to court over stolen cows and property disputes and adultery and all these other things, and then all of a sudden they were accused of being a witch.
Right.
I think it's retaliation, like you'd mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
So, Catherine Harrison may have been the last known person brought to trial for witchcraft in Hartford, but that didn't mean the accusations and suspicions died down there completely. They actually lasted another 28 years until 1698. The governor of Connecticut from 1692 to 1698, William Jones, wrote a document outlining some guidelines for rooting out supposed witches. He wrote that one way was to pay close attention to what other accused witches said, especially while the accused was dying.
Oh my God.
Another way was just to listen to the townsfolk. If a group was suspicious of a person, they were probably right.
It's just unimaginable.
I know.
Between 1647 and 1697, at least 34 people were accused of witchcraft in Connecticut. 2 men and 9 women were hanged that we know of. Those who were not executed often faced banishment, like Catherine Harrison, or they ran away like good wife heirs.
Official persecution of witches ended in 1715, when legislation was passed that no longer made witchcraft a capital offense.
Right. And I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyways. None of these people were actually practicing witchcraft.
Right. But unlike other states that experienced a witchcraft panic, like Massachusetts, Connecticut, as we said, swept theirs under the rug. Most official records, if any were kept at all, were somehow lost. The only references to it even happening seem to come from people's personal journals or diaries, like that town clerk that he had written that, Alice Young was hanged today, basically.
Right.
On a related note, when I was a kid, one of my favorite books was The Witch of Blackbird Pond, which was written by Elizabeth George Spear. And in the book, the main character, Kit Tyler, is a young girl that comes to the Connecticut colony from Barbados because her uncle that she was living with passed away and she had no other living relatives. So she comes to the Connecticut colony to live with her Puritan aunt and uncle. And Kit befriends an old Quaker woman named Hannah, and then Hannah is accused of witchcraft. And as an adult, I realize that the book, which was written in the 1950s, does have some historical inaccuracies. And it also paints the Puritans in a totally unflattering light, which is basically what we've just done for 40 minutes. But
that's to their own. They did that to themselves.
Right. But the book itself isn't really about witchcraft at all. It's really about the power that one group can have when they misunderstand or judge a single person who doesn't fit into their beliefs of how a person should act. So it's really a metaphor for any sort of suppression or, any of those types of things.
And it still goes on to this day.
Well, that's what's I'm leading up to. So in 2002, a group in Cromwell, Connecticut, drafted a petition to have the Witch of Blackbird Pond banned from their school curriculum. They claimed that it promotes witchcraft, which it totally doesn't. They also wanted it written into the school guidelines that teachers were prohibited from dressing up as witches on Halloween. They could dress up as other things, just not witches. And they also wanted things like certain worksheets banned, like one that listed the supposed, spells that people were accused of using during the Salem witch trials.
Why?
Because they didn't want anything remotely related to witchcraft to be allowed in the school. In 2002.
It doesn't surprise me. Another group, this one including descendants of the 11 people executed during the Hartford witch trials, had been trying since the early 2000s to get Connecticut to exonerate their ancestors. They formed the CT Witch Trial Exoneration Project. One of the co-founders is Beth Caruso, an author whose writing often focuses on the true history of Connecticut. In 2008 and 2009, they managed to get 2 bills introduced to the legislature that essentially expressed regret for the witchcraft panic, but neither bill made it through.
When we were researching tonight's episode, I thought the story was going to end here, that a group of people were still trying to get Connecticut to recognize their involvement in witch trials and to exonerate those who had been falsely accused and lost their lives. But literally, while we were researching, on May 25th, 2023, actually, the Connecticut Senate voted 33-1 in favor of a resolution that finally exonerates the 11 people falsely accused and executed. The one person who voted no said something like this. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but basically he said he didn't want the people of the past to be blamed for something they may or may not have been wrong about.
That's just freaking-ronic, isn't it?
It's very ironic.
They shouldn't be blamed for something they may or may not have been wrong about.
So I'm thinking the 11 people who were accused as witches in and around Hartford would have the exact same argument. They shouldn't be forgotten just because they may or may not have done something people didn't agree with.
Exactly. Well, it's just hard understanding the mindset of people back then.
I'm sure we'll discover in the months to come something else dark and horrible to share with everybody.
That's what we do.
Because that's what we do.
Well, Beth, I guess that about wraps it up for this episode. Join us again next week for an all-new episode of Where Minds Wander.
See you soon.